Hello, Jeff. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. I'm Lauren from RDU on Stage, and I'm here with Jeff A.R. Jones, who is you are a fight director and teacher, instructor, and I know you do intimacy. Do you have the intimacy certification too?
I'm in process on the intimacy certification. Things kind of shut down. I did a 9-day workshop exactly a year ago. I was in that workshop, and then shortly after that, everything shut down. So I've been doing
Crazy.
some work to prepare towards that, but I haven't been able to quite complete that yet.
Okay, well, you're on the road, on the way. We're going to be talking all about stage combat, fight choreography, intimacy direction. If you have any questions, please post them into the chat, and we will get to them. But for theatrical purposes, for folks who don't know, what is stage combat or fight choreography? Because I think it'll surprise people the scope of what that entails.
So fight choreography is anytime there is a physical altercation on stage, rather than leave that to the chance of two actors swinging whatever it is they're swinging at each other, be it fists or knives or swords or a table lamp, that we actually choreograph that to make sure that everything is safe and looks effective, and is repeatable every night so that everyone can go home and do it again the next day.
Yes, and that can include weapons, no weapons. It can include a hit, a punch, a shove. I mean, that's where it's a broad stroke of everything that includes.
Yeah, there's 8. So the Society of American Fight Directors, which is the group that certified me many years ago, they've got 8 disciplines that are sort of the core disciplines that they test people in, and it's unarmed, knife, single sword, rapier and dagger, small sword, broadsword, sword and shield, and quarterstaff. Those are the 8 sort of basic forms, and other weapon styles will frequently fit into those forms with some modifications. But yeah, in addition to all of those basic forms, there's other things we use on stage. I'm a big fan of heavy weapons, axes and maces and things like that. And I also teach a class called How Do I Kill You With This, which is a found weapons class where people just bring stuff in and we go, all right, how would you use this to attack somebody? How would you use this to defend somebody? Whether it's a pillow or I'm trying to think of what some of my favorite things are: a shoe, a newspaper, an igloo cooler, a guitar case. Those are some of the things people have brought in to try and figure out how to have a battle with.
One of my favorite demos ever was Tara Nicole Williams. I think it was at Theater Fest a couple years ago. She was on crutches and she looked like she couldn't hurt anyone with those crutches. And then she got up and so anything could be a weapon.
Oh, definitely.
What's interesting to me is because I have a young man, my son. He is very into the action movies, and I have seen from the time I was younger to now how on-screen violence, on-screen fights have evolved to the point that in some of these movies it's fairly stunning. Over the course of your career, I mean, people have been fighting on stage since Shakespeare's time. So over the course of your 20 plus year career, how have you seen fights evolve on stage?
When I started, a lot of the training was still rooted in fencing styles. And, rapier and dagger was largely single sword with a dagger in one hand, and every once in a while you'd use it. the biggest change that I've seen over my time is that the more people have discovered older historical manuals, and the internet has been a huge source of information for this. They've been able to go and look and say, you know, broadsword, what we call broadsword, for example, is really more like longsword, and it's been characterized as it's this big heavy weapon and you chop with it. And in reality, it was much more of a fine-tuned, fast, you know, it wasn't about big heavy chops as much as it was about sort of manipulating the blade and point in and around the other blade. So there's been a lot more evolution within each individual style that makes it distinct from the other styles. So rapier and dagger has become much more, I now like to call it rapier and dagger, because where it used to be, I've got a sword, ting, 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 and occasionally I use the dagger. Now they're equal. So I'll use this as much as I'll use that, because I can use this to tie up the other thing to make the attack. And it's really exciting and interesting. One of my favorite weapons. They're all my favorite weapons. I'll be honest.
And you know how to use them safely. I would not recommend using weapons at home. I interviewed you and Tara Nicole Williams and Heather Strickland for the podcast. It seems like a million years ago now, but the podcast just dropped a couple weeks ago.
Yep.
Folks can listen to the whole interview, but one of the most interesting parts of that conversation that we had was talking about if there's so much concern as a parent that I've heard from people that on-screen violence perpetuates violence in our young people. And so we had a brief conversation about this during our podcast, and I want to talk about it here because I found your answers so interesting to this question. Do on-stage fights perpetuate the same kind of violence that we have concerns about on screen?
Good question. And I scientifically don't know that I know the answer. I know back when I was training to be a teacher, we had a discussion one day, and this was back in the but people were very concerned about violence on screen, as you know, it sort of goes in cycles. And studies had been done, and the studies showed pretty conclusively that anytime there was violence on stage, people would leave it and they would want to emulate it. So if you showed kids violence, they would go out and then they would want to take, you know, a whatever and turn it into a sword and whack each other with it. I don't know of any of those studies being done lately. That only means that I don't know of them. I'm sure they're out there. What I find interesting about it for stage is the ability to use it as a moment to examine and discuss the issues around violence. So, you know, there are some times where it's spectacle. You know, if you're doing the Three Musketeers, it's spectacle, it's flashy, it's fun. But there's other shows where you're really looking at what is the purpose of violence? Is violence justified? When is violence justified? Is it ever justified? You know, what are the implications of it happening? How does it change things? Right? So those are sort of the questions I'm more interested in. And the longer I've done it, the more interested I am in, you know, looking at from a show standpoint, from a character standpoint, what happens to the character over the course of the fight? Because, you know, as it has evolved, it used to be you'd be doing a show and then there would be a fight and then you'd sort of go back to the show. And so it was almost like a separate event almost. And we've worked a lot on that so that the show generates the violence. And if we're doing our jobs well, you can't tell when the fight director started working and when when it sort of transitioned from the director to the fight director. of course, always in collaboration. But that idea of who is this character on the other side, because no matter what happens, the characters learned something about themselves, right? If you thought you were going to win and you won, then you've affirmed what you thought you knew. If you thought you were going to win and you lost, well, that's new information that can completely reorient your entire vision of yourself. And the same in the opposite. If you thought you were going to lose and you won, what does that do? And then there's the question of, what do you do to win? What are you willing to do to win, right? Do you drop into, the depths of animalism to be able to win? Well, you won, but at what cost, right? These are the questions that I find way more interesting when we're working on theatrical pieces.
Well, and that speaks to the story. In that same podcast, we were talking about what makes a good fight. And generally, it was how that fight propels the story forward. And so it's not just what someone on YouTube is saying, act, then fight, then act syndrome. So talk about what does make a good fight on stage?
For me, a good fight, it comes from the story. So it's generated by the action. There's not sort of a moment where the action stops and then we start fighting. That it reveals or enhances character. If you're looking at Dangerous Liaisons, or Les Liaisons Dangereuses, if you're talking about the play, now I can't remember the character's name. The young music teacher who's in his first duel and the old guy who's been in a bunch of duels, their fighting styles should be nothing alike, right? And who they are as people will dictate what they are willing to do. The one guy, he's all about deception. So his fighting style will be all about deception. The other one is open and honest and just like, I'm here and I love everybody. And so his fighting style would be open and direct. And so incorporating that, and then do they change? Does he have to become more slippery in order to deal with this opponent? Who is he on the other end of that fight? When they work best, I find that they're like a little microcosm of the conflict of the show as a whole. That like this whole show sort of boils down to how this fight goes. And when I can make that happen, that makes me really happy as a fight director.
And as you're discussing this, all I can think about is the Princess Bride fight. Where it just cracks me up every time that fight with Inigo Montoya and Carrie Ellis's character just cracks me up.
Yeah, that one is most assuredly a classic.
It is. So the Society for American Fight Directors, that the certifying agency or organization that you're talking about, they've been around for 30 years. So this accreditation of staging fights safely and making sure people are trained to do it, that's not newer to theater, newer to film and television, especially, is intimacy choreography, intimacy direction. And oftentimes the fight choreographer or director will also be tasked with intimacy because that person's there. Can you talk to me a little bit about the relationship, if there is one, between intimacy direction and fight choreography?
Yeah, I mean, that's what got me into training with intimacy. Was I was doing shows and I'd be doing the fights for the shows, and the director would say, hey, we've also got this sex scene, and since you're good at getting bodies to work together, can you work on that sex scene? And I go, well, nobody else is gonna, so I guess so. And then it sort of started getting developed as a discipline. And some fight directors are also intimacy choreographers and intimacy directors, and some are not. A pretty good number are not. And I've worked on shows where I was both, and I've worked on shows where we had one of each. And it's always been a good relationship. So it's been very easy to go like, all right, we're going to do this thing, and we're going to get in close to do it. It was the one I did last was Hamlet. So it was, between Hamlet and his mother. So we would sort of talk about what the fight aspect was, and then the intimacy director would step in and go like, okay, and as you're doing this, we're going to do this at this level, we're going to do this at that level. So the intimacy aspect of it was covered, as well as the safety of the fight part of it. So it's making sure that both aspects are taken care of in the way they need to be taken care of.
You were listed as intimacy director on Burning Coal Theater's current production of Forever, which I just thought Mimi did such a beautiful job in her acting. Can you broadly talk about why the theater brought you in for that show? It's a one-person show, so there is no contact. Mimi's not having any contact with another performer. And what kind of work you did on that production?
Yeah, the stage manager put out a call for an intimacy person because they went through their first read-through and they finished that scene, and everybody was like, we need a break. And she sort of looked around and read the room and went, it'd be nice if we had some help on this. So she put out a call, and I got in touch, and it's interesting. I've never done a one-person intimacy scene before, but it was absolutely worthwhile, I think, to have done it, because being a one-person show would be very easy. One of the big things with intimacy is keeping the idea of separation between you as a person and the character that you're playing. So if you're playing a character who undergoes a trauma, you are not traumatizing yourself in the course of playing that character, and that you are keeping it separate from any personal trauma you might already have, right? So you're not rehashing something every night. I always tell people, is this show paying you enough for 5 years of therapy? And the answer is always no. So it was all about finding things that would allow her to access emotion without feeling like she was experiencing the event every night. Right? So even though it was one person, we still choreographed it. So the choreography was smaller, and it was personal. So there'd be times where she touched her hair that was very specific. There'd be breath patterns that were very specific. There'd be gestures in the body that were very specific. And they were put there to make sure the story got told. But as the performer, you've got that list of events that you're going through in your head. So you're not just devolving into, well, I'm feeling this and I'm responding to it. It creates a safe space to access the emotion and be able to tell that story without getting lost in it. And a big part of what we do with intimacy direction is called closure. And it's the aspect of, now that the show is over, I need to take all the feelings that I have from being on stage that are imaginary and leave them, because that's my work and this is my life and they're separate things. And if I don't take the time to intentionally leave them, then it's very easy to carry those in the body, because the body doesn't know the difference, right?
Yes.
And the quickest thing I can point to prove that point is go watch a horror movie, right? You're sitting in a comfortable room with a bowl of popcorn and a soda, and there's nothing scary about that. And yet you will jump, your heart rate will rise, because you are in a position where these factors are affecting. Now take that and make it even more so, because you're putting your body in the position of the things that are happening, right? So we work really hard on closure, so that there's a way to say, like, okay, that is over. That was imaginary. I can put that away and I can go home to my life. There's even, in that show, we even built in a moment of closure within the show, so that after she has that scene, she's got a moment to sort of closure out of that scene and continue with the rest of the show, because it is such an intense scene.
Mm. The interesting thing for me, and cover your ears if you're going to watch Forever this weekend, in the scene that we're talking about is, I don't know how many cameras are actually involved in this production, but one of the cameras is on the mezzanine, the second floor of Burning Coal Theater, the Murphy School Auditorium. And I really did not like that shot. The way they use that camera in Forever, that was my one criticism of the piece, is it seemed odd sometimes they would cut to that shot from above and we'd be looking at the top of Mimi's head. And it was like, don't do that. The only time I actually thought that shot was appropriate was to take that break that you're talking about. So it was really interesting. We have a question from YouTube. Would you say that the separation is more important, or that closure is more important in intimacy than stage combat?
In general, yes. Intimacy tends to be so much more connected to people's emotional states, whether it's positive or negative. And sometimes the positive actually needs more closure than the negative. People feel like, oh, that show was wonderful. I got to hug people and it felt all warm and fuzzy, and I want to leave with that warm, fuzzy feeling, right? But that's actually just as sort of dangerous, because now you're putting those feelings you had for someone on stage onto them in the real world, right? And that's where we get showmances. So, but it also depends on the kind of scene. A lot of stage combat, if you're doing an Errol Flynn style swashbuckly sword fight, that's fairly stylized and doesn't have a lot of resonance in our daily lives today. If you're doing something that's very naturalistic, contemporary, and brutal, where you're, beating someone to death with your hands, you probably should do some closure, whether you're either side of that fight, just to remind yourself that you don't actually kill people, remind your body. And that sounds silly. I have to remind myself I don't, but again, the body doesn't know the difference. The body keeps the score, right?
Absolutely. Does when you're directing either fight or intimacy, when you're coming in as an intimacy director, or fight choreographer, or fight director on a virtual production, so in the case of Forever, they were in the theater, they're performing it live, but we're watching it on screen. So when you're staging something for the screen, does it change how you approach the choreography or the direction to that?
A little bit. We didn't really focus really heavily on the filmed aspect. We really approached it as a theatrical piece that was happening to be filmed. If I was doing it specifically for film, the movements are smaller, the choreography is smaller, smaller things will read. If we're this close to the camera, an eyebrow can tell a lot, right? Whereas if you're in the middle of a big stage and we can see the whole body and the face is relatively small proportionally, that eyebrow may or may not carry as much weight, right? So it's a matter of scale mostly.
Question from YouTube. What techniques do you like best for closure? Do you have any specific techniques?
Yeah, I have sort of several layers of techniques that I do. The first closure technique that I'll do is between the two performers, or however many performers are performing the event. And it can be as simple as you look at each other in the eyes, you take a deep breath together, you thank each other for your work, and you do a double high five, right? The aspects that I want to include are eye contact, breath, before the plague times, contact, and some gratitude, and something that creates sound and touch, right? So it's sort of like a clapper at the start of a film, you know, when you're filming a film scene, right? We're ready to go, scene has started, right? Is that kind of thing. When you go into it, you do it, scene has started. When you're done with it, boom, scene has finished. Thank you for your work. Because again, it reiterates that was work, right? That's not who we are. So that's one level that I'll do. Another level that I'll do is with the entire group, because you never know how people will react to what they're seeing, and you never know what traumas people have had in their lives that this might be referencing. So I'll also do a group closure, same idea, except it'll include the stage manager, because the stage manager is the person who sees the show, you know, as more than anybody else. The ASMs, the crew when appropriate. So it'll involve everybody, and it'll be a closure that everybody can step out of. Sometimes that's not enough. If you're doing a really intense scene, you know, like the one in Forever, it's not enough to just sort of like, okay, we're done, right? That won't cover it. So I like things that will reground you in reality. My favorite is a 5 senses exercise where you pick 5 senses in any order and you do 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So you'll do 5 elements of touch. And so you'll touch something and you'll feel it like really specifically. Like I can feel that ridge of the stitching on the inside of my collar, and I can feel the ribbing on the neckline. And I really focus on the details of it. And then I do 5 things like that. I do 4 things I can look at and really see what all the little details are. Listen to 3 things. If it's music, I try and pick out all the different layers, all the different instruments, you know, taste, smell. And all those things are real, right? They're the things that my senses can take in right here and now. And I really like that as a closure for something that is a more personal closure, right? But you can set up anything that establishes a ritual that transitions you from who you are as a character in the play to who you are in your life that doesn't share those events. I also like picking a specific song that makes you feel a specific way, and that's the first thing you listen to when you drive home after the show. So again, you get in the car and you play that song that just like always makes you happy, or whatever it is, always makes you calm. And that's the first thing. And then once that's done, then we can listen to other stuff. But that's part of the transition out. So those are the different kinds of levels that I do. And a lot of times we come up with, for an individual, we'll come up with a closure for them specifically. Pets are fantastic. Some people really like baths or showers afterwards. Those are also great, just sit in the warm water. But anything that like regrounds reality.
And this speaks to something else. I feel like as plays and musicals get more and more intense in what you're seeing on stage, I think to Jagged Little Pill. Jagged Little Pill was the last Broadway show I saw. And it's a wonderful show. It's a really interesting show, but I saw it on the very first preview night. And so there were no reviews. I had no idea what I was walking into. And it was triggering. And as I walked out of the theater, there were no trigger warnings. And perhaps I just didn't see them, but it's quite possible they were there. But I didn't notice any signage saying, you know, prepare yourself. So how much warning? I've spoken and interviewed people who think that trigger warnings are absolutely necessary for audiences. And I've spoken to others that say, if you're going to see King Lear and you need a trigger warning, then perhaps that's not the show for you to see. So talk about trigger warnings and when it's appropriate for audiences.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a time right now, you know, as a nation, we've been in wars for almost 20 years. There are people with traumas from those kind of events that are combat related. There are people with traumas from personal events. You know, as we've gone through the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement, all the people who have come forward talking about their personal traumas, there's so much trauma out there. Why not let people know? You know, and I've had conversations with people like, oh, we'll ruin the ending. Well, will it? I'm a big fan of them, and the way I'd like to word them, if people ask me how they should word it, is that you've got the sign both in the program and outside the theater, and even where the ticket purchasing is, that says this show contains elements that may be traumatic to some viewers.
Yes.
Please contact the box office if you have further questions. And if you're somebody who doesn't think that applies to you, then you won't even notice it, right? Other than to go like, oh, it's going to be intense. But if you're somebody who knows that if you see a gun on stage, it's going to cause a reaction, you have a chance to call and say, what exactly is in this show? And then they've got, you know, they're trained with a list of what to tell so that you know what you're walking into. And, you know, the argument that, well, if you should know the show and do your research before you go, well, that's a lot of work on the viewer, A. B, even if you research, I mean, just as a thought exercise, after I had that conversation with someone, I went and picked a show that I didn't know, and I went and tried to research it based on that idea. And you know, I looked up reviews of it, I looked up interviews with the people who created it, and nowhere, you know, people aren't going to sort of jump up and say like, hey, in the fourth act, there's this horrible sexual assault scene. That's not generally what comes up in those interviews. So I did a lot of research, and it wouldn't have helped me if that's what I was looking for, right? And yes. Shakespeare especially, where it's open like that, there's a lot of times things are interpreted in ways that, you know, it's not as written, and you can have read the show a bunch of times. I've done Macbeth many, many times. The Macduff family murders are always vastly different. Sometimes they come in, they grab them, they stab the kid because that's in the script, and then they drag everybody off stage, and you imagine the rest. Other times you have directors, the other end of the spectrum, they want it to be a full-on slaughter, sexual assault, everything. Personally, I tend to push back against that. But, you know, no amount of reading the script will tell you that that's how they're going to interpret that scene. So I'm a fan of warnings that let people who need to know. And for people who need to know, they really do need to know. It's not like, oh, I'm scared of seeing blood on stage. It's actually triggering. It actually invokes a trauma response. There's a book called The Body Keeps the Score that talks about they've done brain scans on people who recount traumatic events that they haven't been able to move on from. And the parts of the brain that light up, it's the exact same parts that light up during a trauma. So, you know, it's not something that's imagined, or they're not tough enough, or, you know, all these sort of things that people who don't have to deal with that level of trauma sort of put onto it, right? So I say, you know, let the people who need to know, and if you don't need to know, you can bypass it.
As we talked about closure, do you feel that because there is a fight choreographer or an intimacy director in the room, that actors are able to push themselves further than they would in a scene if that person wasn't there advocating for them?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I've worked on shows. I worked on one show some years back, and the performer let me know that she had recently experienced, you know, a physical trauma that she was still processing. And it was a very, you know, it was a show that involved sexual encounters and things like that. And so she was nervous about what she'd be able to do. And I said, well, we're going to follow you. So you have agency, you have consent, you decide what it is you're going to do, and we'll tell the story within the parameters we need. And I could see at first she didn't really believe me, right? Because that's not how we've been forever. And we sort of got to the first one of those scenes. And I said, you know, hey, here's an idea. What if we did this? And she was like, I don't think so. I was like, cool, that's a no. Let's come up with another idea. And she was like, really? And I was like, well, yeah. And so over the course of the show, knowing that she had the safety to explore and knowing that if she said no, it would be respected, she absolutely opened into that role. And I think was able to go much farther than if she had just sort of been told to tough it out and do these things in that directorial, you know, some directors have that, like, I've got an idea and you have to do it because you're the actor. So I think if it had been that circumstance, she either would not have been able to perform as well, or she would have been re-traumatized by the performance.
Interesting. And I had not thought about this, but I know a few years ago, Measure for Measure was done at RLT, and Rebecca Blum and I had a conversation about this, and she said she really felt that the actors were able to push themselves further because there was an intimacy director coaching them and making sure that they felt safe in that environment. Your background is as a designer, and you've designed sets and costumes. So how does fight choreography and intimacy direction weave its way into design elements? Because that's something else that's kind of fascinating to me. How does it weave its way into costume design, let's say?
Well, to be honest, I haven't designed costumes in quite a while. I shifted over to scenery some years back and mostly work with that these days. I mean, really, my training in intimacy work has just infused everything that I do. So whether I'm in the classroom, I mean, it changed how I teach stage makeup. It changes how I teach. You know, I just taught a props class, and it changed how I taught that. I just have a very different lens on how to interact with people and assumptions not to make about people or about myself and where I should be in space, and just an awareness of others. Scenery, I mean, scenery is a little, I don't know the answer to that, because it's there's a lot of solitary. You know, I design it here in my house on my computer, and then, you know, we build it in a shop, and then we put it in the theater, and you know, I designed for the ballet, so the dancers usually go like, cool. And that's, you know, so how intimacy works into the scenery. I mean, if there's something specific that needs, you know, let's say you're doing a show that's got a nude scene and the actor doesn't want to do the nude scene, you know, you can create a space where you can create the impression of nudity without having the nudity, right? You could do a backlit kind of area, but having the acknowledgement of an intimacy idea that you're going to protect this person, rather than, well, it says in the script they should be naked, so I'm going to make a big platform for them to be naked on. You know, what can you provide that helps that? I guess is sort of where my mind goes.
Well, and I'm thinking in terms of, for example, Singing in the Rain. You have that classic scene of Donald O'Connor, make him laugh. He's coming through the wall. You know, he basically crashes through a wall, and it's a very funny moment. But something like that, I'm guessing the set has to be constructed in a way that he can do that safely and not kill himself each time. Or the RLT Measure for Measure. I know I had a conversation with Ketty, who designed the costumes on that show. There was padding. in some of the skirts and stuff to protect the actors from having some of those triggers, from creating that safe space when it came to intimacy direction. So that's more what I'm asking, I guess, how a choreographed fight or a choreographed piece of intimacy might impact the design. Because if I'm sitting at home and I'm just designing a set, not thinking that someone's going to come crashing through a wall, then I'm going to design it differently.
Yeah. And in that regard, the workshop that I was at a year ago, we had an entire session on like padding and undergarments and just skin barriers. Even if it was as simple as a bandage, so it wasn't skin on skin, but it was skin on something on skin. And what were good materials to use for those and that kind of thing. On film, a lot of that used to fall to the costume designers and the costumers who had run interference. So when they saw that somebody was uncomfortable on set and was in a position where they'd be like, hang on, we need to fix the costume. And then they would go in and be like, hey, come back to the costume trailer. And then they'd get the person out of there. When I studied with Alicia Rodice, who is the intimacy coordinator for HBO. And she said when she first got on set, the costume folks were sort of the most like, well, we protect people. What are you doing? And once they found out that she was also protecting them, then they were buddies, right? But they were the ones who were running the interference. But yeah, there's all kinds of padding you can put on people for fight things. If you're doing any kind of breakaways or any kind of heavy stunts, if you're doing the fall down the stairs in Noises Off, and you're doing the full like trip and roll down the stairs, you need some body padding and some body armor, and you need to build the costume so that it doesn't look like you're wearing a suit over BMX body armor, right? So it's got to be constructed in such a way, or maybe you build your own padding underneath it. As a fight director, when I go in, one of my first questions is almost always what parts of the set are solid and what parts of the set are not. Can I throw somebody up against a wall? Can I swing a sword at this post? Or is this post made of styrofoam? And if I swing a sword at it, it'll take a chunk out of it. And sometimes you'll make modifications. If there's a big moment that you really need to happen, you might modify how that set is built. Or you will modify what the fight moves need to be around how the set is constructed. So it's a back and forth in the development stage.
And the biggest thing here, I guess, that I'm hoping the big takeaway people take away from this, somebody on YouTube said this as well, is that it's setting up an environment, a culture of consent in your space, in your production, and that I think has to start from those initial conversations between director and designers, and hopefully fight or intimacy person if they brought that person in. It's probably best, I guess, that they bring the intimacy or fight person in those early stages, and not kind of as an afterthought when they're in the middle of staging a scene and they get in trouble, I'm guessing.
Yeah, the earlier the better, because a good fight intimacy person, if you bring them in when you're in the developmental stage, when you're doing the scenic designs and the costume designs and all that stuff, they can really work within the style of the show. They can really work, like, oh, I've got this great idea for a fight thing. Can we make the set be able to do this? And the scenic designer can say, well, yeah, we can do that because we haven't built it yet, right? Whereas if you come in and they're halfway through production and you say, it'd be really great if we could slam somebody up against this wall, and it's like, well, that wall's been built, we're not going to rebuild it. Right. So you lose some of the collaborative efforts there if you come in later. There's a point at which all we can do is kind of triage, right? if I come in when we're staging the scene, you know, the scene hasn't been staged yet, and I come in and work with the director on the staging of the scene, then it'll feel really integral and organic, right? Because we'll be collaborating on it up until the point where like they're literally hitting each other with the swords, and even then. Whereas if it's a situation where something's been staged and you're right before tech and you realize it's not really safe or doesn't really look good, and now all the staging is set and we need to modify it, the constraints are so much at that point that trying to find the best answer gets hampered by the answer you have to have, because this is where the lighting is and it's already been set and focused, and you know, we go into, you know, we go out of tech tomorrow, so we can't be, you know, if we move that light, we've got to rearrange everything. So, you know, the earlier you bring somebody on, just the better your product will be, because you've got that integrated workflow.
Absolutely. When I think of stage combat or intimacy on stage, I'm usually thinking of two or more people coming in contact with each other. And now we're living in this really interesting pandemic time where we're supposed to be social distancing and staying 6 feet apart. I know on the Society of American Fight Directors website, they have put out some guidelines for safe fights, for training safely, for virtual training. So what protocols and safety guidelines are being put in place now for both intimacy and stage combat? And what do you think this is going to look like in the immediate future?
Yeah. Okay. A lot of questions in that one question. So
yeah, sorry.
That's fine. That's fine. So where we are right now, basically, we're not doing any unarmed, kind of as a matter of course, because you can't really do it at 6 feet. You could train the skills, but as a student, it would be pretty, like, you know, the payoff of performing a fight scene where you can grab somebody and look like you need them in the stomach. You know, you could mime that all from a distance, but it wouldn't have the payoff for a student. All of my classes currently, which are normally unarmed classes because that is the most useful weapon style to learn, have all been converted to single sword, because that you can do at a 6 foot distance and maintain a 6 foot distance. And even within that training, I'm doing a lot more. You're going to learn your side of the fight, work on it as a kata in slow motion, maybe even work on it opposite somebody who's doing the other side of the fight. And then we're going to come together and work on it in contact. And before, you would have paired two people up and said, all right, here's the first move and the block for the first move. Here's the second move, reply, and the parry for that. And so I'm just minimizing the time, even at 6 feet, I'm minimizing the time that they're sort of in range of each other, so that we work that for like 15 minutes and then work on the form separately and then come back in and work on that. So we're not sort of parking ourselves in close distance to someone and then heavy breathing, even with a mask on, for an hour, right? So trying to keep that separation, taking more breaks, which is probably good to do anyway. So those are the big things that I've experienced training-wise personally. Nationally, there's been a lot more online training. There's a robust bunch of workshops that happen over the course of a year. In any given month, there's probably a workshop that lasts 3 days or longer somewhere in the country. And all of those got shut down. And some of them figured out a way to do an online version of it. And some places sort of turned that into a business model. The one was called the Social Distance Showdown, and it was able to bring in even more people from greater distances because you could bring in somebody from Norway because you didn't have to fly them to wherever it is you're doing the workshop. So you're able to get a lot broader input from people. Humble Warrior Movement Arts, run by Samantha Egley, has sort of converted that into a regular thing. So she'll have guests in who do either single workshops or multiple week workshops. I'm currently taking a class in Filipino martial arts with a guy in Australia. And I've not been able to do that any other time, either for time or cost, right? So those are things that I kind of hope stay around because I think it increases the accessibility for people. It makes it able to get much more diverse training because you can get to more different kinds of people with different kinds of backgrounds and different kinds of weapons. I took a course in African martial arts with Damon Stith at one of these workshops. It was amazing. So I think I really hope that sticks around. It's not perfect. What I have found is it works best if it's something that you're new to, where you have where you're literally learning how to do all the basic things. And it's really good if it's something that you already know well and you're going to discuss it about how to refine it. That sort of middle ground where you've got some skill and it would really be helpful if somebody could walk over and look at your grip that they might not be able to see on the camera. Those don't work as well, in my opinion. I did not find those courses to be as effective as the ones that were things that I was new to or things that I was well versed in. But I do really hope that aspect of it hangs around when we go back to the after times.
It makes the world feel a little bit like a smaller place. So we'll see. You started Stage Combat Academy of North Carolina many years ago. You were offering training programs and certification opportunities, which really was a community or has been a community resource because these are programs you usually find only in an academic setting. So how has COVID impacted your organization, your company?
We've been pretty much non-existent. The space that I use at Carolina Ballet has a lot of because they're back to producing shows. They've got dancers in there every day. They've got very, very strict protocols for people being in the space. In terms of numbers, in terms of there's forms you have to fill out. You have to be tested weekly. When you walk in the door, there's a whole health screen that happens. And I wanted to respect their space and not have them wondering if I was following the same. I would follow whatever protocols they asked. But I wouldn't want them wondering if the space was safe on Monday morning because there were people in there on Sunday night. And personally, I don't feel ready to re-engage with it. We keep having these spikes and the spike goes down, but it hasn't gotten down to where it was when we closed things down before. And then we have another spike and then it goes down and we open everything back up. So I'm waiting for it to go further down. While we've been closed, I've been rethinking a lot of things. While we've been out for COVID, there's been a lot of stuff happening in the world. Issues of equity, issues of accessibility in the arts, the whole We See You White American Theater, super informative. I've been trying to take that information and figure out how I need to change to have it be more accessible.
Mhm.
And I've got some things I'm working on. I'm not done. I'm still learning. But I'm looking at flexible pricing. I'm looking at scholarships. I'm looking at. I'm probably going to change the name, because when I came up with the name and I thought that the acronym was, kind of cute. It's been pointed out to me by some of my women students that acronym has been used, weaponized against them since they were children. So I'm currently looking at a new name, trying to find a good name to replace that with. There's also a little more, is not just stage combat, but is more movement art focused. So those are just some of the things that I'm looking at in terms of adjustments before we come back. Because I want it to be open to everyone. I want everyone to feel welcome. I want everyone to feel included, and have a place to belong.
So many artists, we focus on the actors and the artists who have been out of work, who really last year saw all of their gigs, who are dependent on the gig economy, and who saw all of their gigs just literally overnight be canceled. Stage choreographers, intimacy directors are in that group of people. So what can theaters do to be mindful of those very necessary people? How can we support our stage combat folks and intimacy directors at this time?
I mean, one of the catches at this time is a lot of theater companies just trying to figure out how to still be around when it's time to reopen. And so there isn't work. It'd be lovely if they all had endowments that they could just like hand out money for the show you would have worked on. But that's not reality. I think the big thing is, as we look towards coming back, my fear is that when we're finally able to come back, theaters will want to do shows that will draw audiences. So they'll fall back on those really big shows, the really big spectacle shows. But with a year of no income, they won't have the money to really properly produce that show. And so they'll say to people, well, we're going to do this show, but we can't pay you what we would have paid you a year ago. And all of the people who are hungry to be back on stage and hungry to be doing their art will say, that's fine, because we just want to do it. And it'll lead to just an across the board depression of, fees that people earn and the money that they earn for doing what they do. That's my fear. I hope it doesn't work that way. And if theaters are being accountable as they say they are, or say they're planning to be, most of the documents that have come out, Not in Our House, We See White American Theater, all specifically mention in the creation of safe spaces having professional fight and intimacy people, to make sure that the performers are safe. So I hope that that's how it goes. It's a really tricky business model, because you've got ticket sales that only account for part of it, and then you've got donors who expect certain things, and so I don't envy the people who have to make those decisions, but that's how I see it from my side.
Well, this has been such an amazing conversation. I'm so glad we had the chance to reconnect and catch up since COVID, since our podcast interview, because the world has changed, and I think it will continue.
Oh, I think we lost your mic.
I was getting, can you hear me? I was getting a little bit of an echo, so I was turning this mic off and using the computer mic. But I think these are important conversations to have. And I hope the theaters, like you said, will continue to be accountable, because I think on our regional stages, we have seen a lot of companies employ intimacy people and fight people. And so hopefully that will continue. I was shocked to find out that even though TV shows like the HBO shows that you mentioned are using intimacy people, that the first Broadway show was Frankie and Johnny, and that was just a couple of years ago, that employed an intimacy person. So hopefully we'll start to see these things appear on our national stages as well as a norm. So thank you for hanging out with me. This was really fun. And
My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
I told you an hour would fly by. So, and thank you everyone for joining us. We had some folks on YouTube and Facebook tonight. So thank you for hanging out with us and tuning in. If you tuned in late, you can watch this from its entirety, either on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll be posting it on the RDU on Stage website in a couple of days, so you can catch it there. And come back tomorrow. I will be, we're taking a virtual field trip for our Field Trip Friday, and we're going to go check out Cape Fear Regional Theater. So come back and join us for that. So thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. Stay safe and healthy. You know, hopefully I will see you soon in person, on stage, wherever. Thanks everyone for joining us.